Brotherhood of the Mirror. Part 1. Chapter 1, City of Shadows. The rain did not fall so much as it hung in the air, a perpetual, misting shroud that soaked a man to the bone without the courtesy of a clean, heavy downpour. It was the kind of rain that bred moss on stone and melancholy in the soul. Elandor stood at the edge of the forest, the great, brooding mass of the elder mark at his back, and looked down upon the city of BacHoll. It lay in the valley like a collection of wet, grey stones, the river Hull a sluggish, pewter ribbon winding through its heart. The only signs of life were the faint, orange glimmers of lanterns struggling against the encroaching twilight, and the distant, mournful clang of a monastery bell. "A fitting place for shadows," a voice said, so soft it was almost part of the drizzle. Sayako emerged from the tree-line, her movements fluid and silent, a part of the landscape itself. The dark, close-fitting attire she wore drank the light, and the mask she wore, bearing the faint crescent symbol of her lost clan, left only her sharp, intelligent eyes visible. They missed nothing. "Shadows are what we were sent to find," Elandor replied, his voice a low rumble. He adjusted the strap of his leather satchel, heavy with tools, jars, and his most precious possession, a thick, leather-bound notebook filled with sketches and observations of things most men would rather not believe existed. His long, earth-colored cloak was beaded with moisture, but his lean frame, honed by a past he could not outrun, showed no sign of the chill. He was a naturalist by trade now, a scholar of the rare and the aberrant. But the body of a warrior, a former blade of the king's secret guard, does not forget its training so easily. The scars that traced a pale path across his left cheek and jaw were a permanent reminder of that other life, a life that had ended in fire and failure. The steel gray of his eyes, often lost in analysis, could still harden in an instant to the cold focus of a soldier assessing a threat. "The reports are consistent," he continued, more to himself than to her. 17 disappearances in as many months. Not a single body found. No signs of struggle, save for one recurring detail. He glanced at Sayako, and she gave a single, slight nod. "The mirrors," she said. "Always the mirrors." Witnesses, those few who were there, spoke of a strange sheen on the glass in the victims' homes afterward, a silver, oily residue that smelled of ozone and decay. And the victims themselves, in the days leading to their vanishing, had become withdrawn, speaking of seeing movements in the periphery of their reflections. The king's summons had been explicit. The crown could not be seen to move openly against Lord Orivan, a powerful noble and royal advisor whose domain was BacHoll. Rumors of a strange cult, the Order of the Silver Visage, were too nebulous for the royal guard. This required a subtler touch. A disgraced former guardsman and his foreign shadow, operating without official sanction, were perfect for the task. A chance for atonement, the king's spymaster had implied, though the words had been left unsaid. Elandor felt their weight nonetheless. They descended the winding path into the city as true darkness fell. BacHoll was a city of two faces. The outer districts were a maze of narrow, cobbled streets where timber-framed houses leaned against one another for support, their upper floors jutting out like gossiping old women. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, wood smoke, and the faint, sour tang of the tanneries. People moved quickly, their heads down, their gazes averted. They did not look at the puddles, Elandor noted, as if afraid of what they might see reflected in the murky water. The inner city, surrounding Lord Orivan's castle, was a different world. Here, the buildings were of solid, dressed stone, and the streets were wider, cleaner. The castle itself, Sylvan Keep, was a formidable structure of dark granite, its towers piercing the low-hanging clouds like stone spears. Torches flickered in iron sconces on the walls, their light dancing across the wet cobblestones. They were expected. The guards at the keep's gate, clad in the silvern livery of silver and deep green, were stern but courteous. They were led through a cavernous hall where tapestries depicting heroic hunts and historic battles did little to dispel the chill. The air inside was still and old. Lord Orivan awaited them in his private study, a room lined with books and mounted specimens of exotic animals. A large fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, shifting shadows. Orivan rose from behind a heavy oak desk. He was a man in his late 50s, but carried his years with an austere grace. His hair was a striking silver, swept back from a high forehead, and his features were sharp and intelligent. He was dressed in rich, dark velvet, impeccably tailored. He was the picture of a benevolent, if somewhat cold, ruler. "Master Elandor," Orivan said, his voice smooth and measured. He extended a hand, his grip firm. "And your companion? Sayako, is it? Welcome to BacHoll. I understand the king has taken an interest in our troubles." His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, flickered between them, lingering on Sayako for a moment with a hint of distaste he quickly masked. Elandor felt Sayako go still beside him, a predator sensing a dismissive gaze. "The king values the stability of all his domains, Lord Orivan," Elandor said neutrally. "He thought my particular skills might be of use." "A scholar of rare phenomena," Orivan said, a faint smile touching his lips. It did not reach his eyes. "Yes, I have read your monographs on the spectral echoes in the northern marshes. Fascinating work. Though I fear you may find our problem here to be of a more mundane, if tragic, nature." "Despair, Master Elandor. Despair and the desperation that drives people to abandon their homes. The harvests have been poor, the winters long. BacHoll has always been a city that tests the spirit." It was a plausible explanation, expertly delivered. But Elandor had spent a lifetime learning to read the spaces between words. Orivan was too calm, too ready to dismiss the peculiarities. He was playing a part. "Perhaps," Elandor conceded. "But my duty is to investigate all possibilities. We would like to examine the sites of the disappearances, starting with the most recent." "Of course," Orivan said smoothly. "My seneschal will provide you with every assistance. You are guests in my home. Please, consider the keep your own. I have had rooms prepared for you." He gestured to a servant waiting by the door. "Rest tonight. The rain makes the streets treacherous after dark. You can begin your work in the morning." It was not a suggestion. After they were shown to their adjoining rooms, sparse but clean chambers with high, narrow windows, Elandor stood by the door, listening as the servant's footsteps faded. Sayako appeared at the connecting doorway, having soundlessly inspected her room. She had removed her mask, revealing a face of serene, sharp plain beauty, marked by a fine, silvery scar along her jawline and the deep sorrow that always lingered in her almond-shaped eyes. Her black hair was coiled in a tight knot. "He lies," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Elandor nodded, moving to the small window. He looked down into the central courtyard of the keep. "He plays a part. But he is nervous. Did you see the mirror?" Sayako joined him. Across the courtyard, mounted on the wall of the opposite wing, was a large, ornate mirror in a silver frame, intricately worked with spirals and knots. Even from this distance, and through the drizzle, the glass seemed too bright, too clear. It captured the torchlight in a way that felt aggressive, possessive. "It watches," Sayako said simply. Elandor's hand went unconsciously to the amulet he wore under his tunic, a simple, worn piece of metal stamped with the king's falcon, a relic of his old life. He had lost his comrades once, betrayed by a web of lies and an enemy they never saw. He would not let it happen again. The truth was here, in this rain-sodden city, hiding behind the silvered smile of a nobleman and the deceptive stillness of glass. He turned from the window, the misty lights of BacHoll sprawling below them like a web waiting to be untangled. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice grim. "We find the cracks in his story." Sayako gave a slow, deliberate blink of agreement. In the silence of the room, the only sound was the relentless patter of rain against the glass, a rhythm that felt less like weather and more like a counting down of seconds before a storm. Chapter 2, First Traces. The morning brought no reprieve from the rain, only a shift in its character from a mist to a steady, drumming downpour that turned the streets of BacHoll into shallow rivers of mud and filth. Elandor and Sayako were met by Lord Orivan's seneschal, a gaunt, silent man named Corvin whose face was a mask of dutiful neutrality. He provided them with a list of addresses and a pair of burly, unsmiling guards who followed at a discreet distance, ostensibly for their protection, but Elandor knew a surveillance detail when he saw one. Their first stop was a modest weaver's cottage in the outer city, the home of a man named Alaric, the most recent to vanish. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp wool and the faint, metallic tang of a cold hearth. A half-finished tapestry sat frozen on the loom, a scene of a sunny meadow that seemed a cruel joke in the gloom of the cottage. The wife found the door unbarred from the inside one morning, Corvin intoned, his voice devoid of inflection. He was simply gone. Elandor moved through the single-room dwelling with a methodical precision, his naturalist's eye cataloging every detail. He ran a finger along the edge of the rough-hewn table, examined the contents of the cold fireplace, and studied the patterns of dust. Sayako was a phantom beside him, her presence felt more than seen. She knelt, studying the floorboards near the door, her head tilted. "No sign of forced entry," Elandor murmured. "No disturbance. It's as if he walked out of his own volition. Or was invited out." His gaze then fell upon the only object in the room that seemed out of place with its humble surroundings, a small, round hand mirror on a shelf above the wash basin. Its frame was of plain, unvarnished wood, but the glass itself was of an exceptionally fine quality, far too expensive for a simple weaver. It was spotlessly clean. "A gift," Corvin supplied, noticing his focus. "From the Lord's household, to mark the man's 10th year of service. A token of appreciation." Elandor picked up the mirror. It was cold in his hand, unnaturally so. He angled it, watching the gray light from the window slide across its surface. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker in the reflection behind him, a shape that was not Sayako's silent form or Corvin's rigid posture. A pale, gaunt face that was gone before he could focus. He suppressed a shudder, the ghost of a memory, his comrades' faces, contorted in their final moments, threatening to surface. He placed the mirror back on the shelf with deliberate care. Did Alaric speak of anything unusual before he disappeared? Elandor asked, turning to face Corvin. Changes in behavior? Perhaps an interest in his reflection? Corvin's expression remained a blank slate. Grief plays tricks on the mind, Master Elandor. His wife said he had been tired, distant. He spoke of strange dreams. But as I said, despair is a common ailment here. They visited 2 more homes, each story a variation on the same theme. A cobbler's apprentice, a young woman with a bright future, vanished from her locked room. A fishmonger, a loud and boisterous man known to all, had stepped out for air one night and never returned. In each dwelling, Elandor found a mirror. Sometimes it was a large, household piece, other times a small, personal item. But they were always there, and they were always gifts, distributed by the Lord's household as tokens of favor or charity. At the fishmonger's house, a ramshackle building that stank of the river, Elandor made his most significant discovery. While Corvin and the guards waited outside, ostensibly to avoid the stench, Elandor examined a cracked shaving mirror on a windowsill. The crack, a jagged lightning bolt across the surface, seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light. He leaned closer. There, etched into the silvering along the edge of the crack, was a tiny, almost invisible symbol, a single, unblinking eye enclosed within a spiraling circle. It was the same symbol he had seen carved into a standing stone in the northern marshes, a place the locals called the Watcher's Hill, and avoided after dark. Sayako, he whispered. She was at his side in an instant. He pointed to the symbol. Her sharp intake of breath was the only sign of her surprise. She reached into a hidden pocket of her attire and produced a small, silken pouch. From it, she took a pinch of fine, gray powder, ground ash from a sacred tree from her homeland. She sprinkled it over the mirror's surface. Where the powder touched the glass, it did not fall away. Instead, it clung, coalescing into a faint, shimmering silver trail that led from the mirror's surface down the wall, vanishing into the floorboards. It was a residue, a spectral pathway. The trail of a soul, she murmured, her voice hushed with grim certainty. It was pulled through here. The door opened, and Corvin stood silhouetted against the gray light. Have you found anything of note, Master Elandor? Elandor straightened up, casually brushing the remaining ash from his fingers. Nothing conclusive, he said, his face a mask of scholarly disappointment. Just the effects of damp and neglect. This city is hard on its possessions. Corvin's eyes swept the room, lingering for a moment on the mirror before returning to Elandor. Indeed. The Lord has invited you to dine with him this evening. He is eager to hear your preliminary thoughts. As they followed Corvin back through the muddy streets towards the oppressive bulk of Sylvan Keep, Elandor felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them. The mirrors in the windows of the houses they passed seemed less like household objects and more like portholes, each one a potential gateway for the malevolent presence they were hunting. The charitable gifts of Lord Orivan were not tokens of appreciation, they were baited hooks. And the entire city of BacHoll was the pond. That evening, in the grand hall of the keep, the contrast was jarring. A roaring fire blazed in a hearth large enough to stable a horse. Tapestries depicting sylvan glades and heroic stags seemed to mock the decaying reality outside. Lord Orivan sat at the head of a long table laden with roasted fowl, spiced wine, and white bread, a feast in a time of purported despair. "So," Orivan said, raising a goblet of deep red wine. "What are your impressions of our fair city, Master Elandor? Have your investigations shed any light on our sad predicament?" Elandor chose his words with the care of a man walking through a field of buried caltrops. "The city bears the scars of hardship, my lord. And the people carry a great weight of fear. It is a fertile ground for superstition." Orivan's smile was thin. "Superstition. Yes. The common folk speak of a glasshound that stalks the fog, or a mirror wraith that steals faces. Nonsense, of course, but it comforts them to put a name to their misery." "Perhaps," Elandor said, meeting Orivan's gaze squarely. "But I have found that where there is smoke, there is often a spark. Even if it is just the spark of human cruelty." A flicker of something cold and sharp passed through Orivan's pale eyes, gone so quickly Elandor might have imagined it. "Human cruelty is a constant, scholar. But I assure you, my guards patrol diligently. We have found no evidence of foul play." The conversation turned to trivialities, but the tension thrummed beneath the surface like a plucked bowstring. Sayako, seated slightly behind Elandor, said nothing, her eyes scanning the hall, the servants, the shadows in the corners. She noted the way Orivan's daughter, a young woman with dark hair and intelligent, golden-tinged eyes named Yulavana, watched her father with a mixture of affection and apprehension. She did not partake in the false bonhomie. Later, back in his chamber, Elandor stared out at the rain-lashed night. The ornate mirror across the courtyard was a pool of absolute blackness now, reflecting nothing. "He knows we are getting closer," Elandor said softly as Sayako entered. "The mirrors are the key. They are the method. Orivan is the source. But the why still eludes me." Sayako stood beside him. "The symbol. The Eye of Vitra. It is an ancient sign of a watcher from beyond. A consumer of souls." Elandor nodded, the pieces clicking into a terrifying mosaic. A nobleman distributing cursed mirrors. A demon that fed on reflections and souls. A cult operating in the shadows. It was a conspiracy of glass and silver, and they were standing in the heart of it. The hunt had begun in earnest, and he knew, with a cold certainty that settled in his gut, that the prey was already aware of the hunters. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice low and hard. "We leave the city. We need to see the places where the vanished were last seen. The forests, the riverbanks. We need to draw them out." Sayako's hand rested lightly on the hilt of one of her curved blades. A silent agreement. The game was afoot, and the next move would be theirs. But in the darkness of BacHoll, surrounded by 1,000 watching mirrors, Elandor could not shake the feeling that they were the ones being played. Chapter 3, Ambush in the Fog. The forest that clung to the slopes above BacHoll was known as the Whisperwood. It was an apt name. The dense canopy of ancient oaks and ironwoods trapped the perpetual mist, turning the air thick and clammy. Sounds were muffled, distorted. A snapped twig could seem like a shout, and a whisper could carry for miles. It was a place where the boundary between the real and the imagined blurred, a perfect hunting ground. Elandor led the way, his naturalist's instincts guiding him along a game trail barely visible through the thick undergrowth. He moved with a predator's caution, his senses stretched taut. Beside him, Sayako was a wraith, her footfalls making no more sound than a falling leaf. They had left the two guards at the edge of the wood with a plausible excuse about tracking a rare species of phosphorescent moss Elandor claimed to be studying. The lie had been accepted, but the weight of their deception hung in the air, heavier than the fog. They were searching for the place where the cobbler's apprentice had last been seen, a spot near a lightning-blasted oak where she claimed to have heard singing from the trees. The official report called it a suicide, a desperate girl lost to the woods. Elandor knew better. The mirrors in the town were the traps, but the forest felt like the larder. "The air is wrong," Sayako murmured, her voice a thread of sound meant for his ears alone. Elandor nodded, his hand resting on the worn leather cover of his journal. "It's too quiet. Even for this place." The normal sounds of the forest, the scuttling of insects, the calls of birds, had fallen away, leaving a silence that was itself a presence. It was then that they found it. Not the blasted oak, but a small, unnaturally circular clearing. In its center stood a crude stone altar, slick with moss and moisture. But it was not the altar that chilled Elandor's blood. It was the objects arranged upon it. Dozens of shards of broken mirror, each one carefully placed to reflect the oppressive gray sky above. And in the center of the shards, a single, silver mask. It was featureless, smooth, and polished to a high sheen, reflecting the fog in a way that made it seem like a hole into nothingness. "The Order of the Silver Visage," Elandor breathed. He approached the altar, his every sense screaming in warning. As he drew closer, he saw that the mask was not entirely featureless. Etched into its forehead, almost invisible, was the same spiraling eye symbol they had found on the fishmonger's mirror. "Elandor," Sayako's voice was sharp, a blade of sound cutting through the silence. He turned. The fog at the edge of the clearing was thickening, coalescing into shapes. Tall, slender figures emerged from the gray veil, moving with an unnerving, synchronized grace. There were 6 of them, clad in robes the color of tarnished silver. And on each of their faces was an identical, featureless silver mask. They carried no obvious weapons, but their hands were clad in gloves tipped with what looked like shards of obsidian. They fanned out, surrounding the clearing, cutting off any escape. They made no sound, their silence more threatening than any battle cry. "Who are you?" Elandor demanded, his voice echoing flatly in the dead air. "What is the meaning of this?" The lead cultist, slightly taller than the others, tilted its head. A voice emerged from behind the mask, not a shout, but a dry, rustling whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. "The naturalist who digs for truths better left buried." And the shadow from a forgotten land. You look into mirrors that were not meant for you. Elandor's mind raced, assessing threats, plotting angles. Lord Orivan sends his regards, I assume. The cultist gave a soft, rattling sound that might have been a laugh. Lord Orivan is an instrument. A valuable one. But you are a disturbance. A flawed reflection. You will be cleansed. There was no further warning. The cultists moved as one, their attack a fluid, silent ballet of death. They were fast, impossibly fast, their movements eerily predictive. Elandor barely had time to draw the long, utilitarian knife from his belt before the first was upon him. The fight was a nightmare of shifting fog and silver reflections. The cultists fought not like brawlers, but like extensions of the mist itself, their gloved hands slashing at him with razor-sharp glass. He parried a strike aimed at his throat, the impact jarring his arm. He was a trained warrior, but this was different. It was like fighting smoke. Beside him, Sayako was a whirlwind of controlled violence. Her twin curved blades were a blur, deflecting attacks with a series of sharp, musical chimes as metal met glass. She moved with an economy of motion that was beautiful and deadly, flowing between opponents, her every movement a counterstrike. She disabled one cultist with a precise cut to the back of its knee, sending it crumpling silently to the mossy ground. But the cultists were relentless. They seemed to feel no pain, no fear. When one fell, another took its place, their coordination flawless. Elandor found himself separated from Sayako, driven back towards the stone altar by two of the masked figures. He fought with the grim determination of a man who had faced death before and had no intention of greeting it as an old friend. He used his environment, kicking up damp leaves to obscure their vision, using the altar itself as a barrier. He saw an opening and lunged, his knife finding a gap in the robes of one cultist. There was a gasp, a sound shockingly human, and the figure staggered back, a dark stain spreading on its silver garment. Sayako, he yelled, trying to locate her in the chaos. He caught a glimpse of her through the fog, engaged with the lead cultist. She was holding her own, her blades a defensive shield against the cultist's flurry of attacks. But then, one of the fallen cultists, the one she had hamstrung, moved. With a final, desperate surge of strength, it threw a glittering object through the air. It was a shard of mirror from the altar. Sayako, focused on her primary opponent, sensed the movement too late. She twisted, but the shard, spinning end over end, sliced deep into her side, just above her hip. It was not a fatal blow, but it was a grievous one. She cried out, a short, sharp gasp of pain and surprise, her flawless form breaking for a single, crucial second. The lead cultist seized the opportunity. It bypassed her faltering defense and slammed a glass-tipped hand into her chest, not with a stabbing motion, but with a flat, palm strike that seemed to drain the very air from her lungs. Sayako was thrown backward, crashing into the base of a large oak tree. She slid to the ground, her blades falling from limp fingers, her body shuddering. Sayako. Elandor's roar was raw, torn from a place of primal fear. The memory of his fallen comrades, dying helplessly around him while he stood powerless, flooded his mind with a white-hot rage. He abandoned all defense, becoming a storm of violence. He disarmed one cultist with a brutal twist of his wrist, shattering the bones, and drove his knife into the throat of another. The remaining cultists hesitated, their silent coordination broken by the ferocity of his assault. The lead cultist looked from Elandor, now standing over Sayako's still form like a vengeful spirit, to its own fallen members. It made a sharp gesture with its hand. "VitraMor awaits you both," it whispered. "In the glass, you will find your end." Then, as silently as they had appeared, the cultists melted back into the fog, dragging their wounded with them. In moments, the clearing was empty again, save for Elandor, the unconscious Sayako, and the broken mirrors on the altar, which now seemed to gleam with a sinister satisfaction. Elandor dropped to his knees beside Sayako. Her breathing was shallow, a faint mist of blood on her lips. The wound in her side was bleeding freely, but it was the other injury that terrified him. Where the cultist's palm had struck her, the dark fabric of her attire was undamaged, but the skin beneath, visible at her collar, was marbled with a strange, silver tracery, like cracks in porcelain. It was cold to the touch. He had seen enough of the world's horrors to know dark magic when he encountered it. This was more than a physical wound. It was a corruption. Gently, desperately, he gathered her into his arms. She was light, a terrible fragility in her disciplined strength. The fog closed in around them, the whisperwood living up to its name as the wind seemed to carry the faint, mocking rustle of the cultist's voice. "You look into mirrors that were not meant for you." Cradling his blood-bonded sister, the only person who anchored him to a purpose beyond his own guilt, Elandor knew one thing with absolute certainty. The hunt was over. Now, it was a war. And the first blow had been struck, not against him, but against the one thing he could not bear to lose again. Chapter 4, The Faceless Reflection. The journey back to Sylvan Keep was a blurred nightmare of fog and agony. Elandor carried Sayako's limp form, her blood soaking through his cloak, a warm, sticky counterpoint to the chilling cold of the silver crack spreading slowly from her chest. Each labored breath she took was a knife twisting in his own gut. The memory of the cultist's whispered threat, "VitraMor awaits you," echoed in his mind, a taunt that fueled his frantic pace. He did not take her to the main gates. To do so would be to announce their discovery and their vulnerability. Instead, he used a servant's entrance he had noted during his initial reconnaissance, slipping into the keep's underbelly like a thief. He carried her not to the rooms provided by Orivan, but to an abandoned storage chamber deep within the lower levels, a dusty space filled with forgotten furniture and the scent of old stone. It was a risk, but a lesser one than being under Orivan's direct gaze. For hours, he worked by the light of a single, guttering tallow candle. He cleaned and stitched the gash in her side with the practiced efficiency of a soldier who had tended battlefield wounds. The injury was clean, physical, he could deal with that. It was the other mark that filled him with a dread colder than the grave. The silver tracery had not spread further, but it pulsed with a faint, sickly light, feeling like ice under his fingertips. It was a brand, a connection to the entity they hunted. Sayako drifted in and out of consciousness. In her lucid moments, her eyes, clouded with pain, would lock with his, and she would try to speak, to warn him. He would silence her with a touch, a shake of his head. "Save your strength," he would murmur, the words a hollow comfort. In her fevered sleep, she whispered in the tongue of her homeland, names of people and places lost to a betrayal he only partly understood. He knew he needed answers, and he could not wait for her to heal. The cult knew they were a threat. Orivan would be watching them more closely than ever. They had to strike now, while the trail was still fresh. And there was one place, one victim's home, they had not yet fully investigated, the cottage of the first to disappear, a reclusive herbalist named Alara. Under the cover of a moonless, rain-lashed night, Elandor left Sayako hidden, as secure as he could make her, with supplies and a blade within reach. He moved through the sleeping keep like a ghost, his own guilt a heavy cloak. Leaving her felt like a betrayal of their bond, but staying felt like a death sentence for them both. Alara's cottage was on the very outskirts of BacHoll, nestled against the encroaching woods. It was a place the city had already begun to reclaim, with ivy clawing at the walls and weeds choking the garden. The door swung open with a groan of protest on rusted hinges. The air inside was thick with the cloying scent of dried herbs gone to dust and something else, the sharp, ozone smell of corrupted magic. This cottage was different from the others. It felt not just abandoned, but violated. Furniture was overturned, dried herbs were scattered across the floor, and deep scratches marred the wooden walls, as if something with claws had been trapped inside. And in the center of the main room, dominating the space, was a massive, standing mirror in a frame of black, twisted iron. This was no gift from Lord Orivan. This was ancient. The glass was not clear, but had a smoky, mercurial quality, a surface that seemed to swirl with captured twilight. Elandor approached it cautiously, the amulet beneath his tunic feeling suddenly warm against his skin. He saw his own reflection, a tall, grim man with rain-soaked hair and eyes shadowed by exhaustion and fear. But as he watched, the reflection shifted. It smiled, a cold, cruel expression he knew his own face was incapable of making. Then it spoke, its voice a perfect mimicry of his own, yet dripping with a venomous amusement. "Hello, Elandor." Elandor froze, his hand instinctively going to his knife. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice rough. The reflection laughed softly. "I am a friend. I am an answer. I am what you see when you stop lying to yourself." It leaned forward, its hands pressing against the inside of the glass, which rippled like water. "You carry such guilt. All those brave men and women, your command, your failure. You see their faces every night, don't you?" "Be silent," Elandor snarled, but he was transfixed. The mirror was showing him not just a doppelganger, but a window into his own soul. "Why should I?" the reflection crooned. "You want to remember them. You need to. It's your punishment. But what if it didn't have to be? What if you could see them again? Not as ghosts in your memory, but alive. Whole." The surface of the mirror swirled, and the image changed. He was no longer looking at his own face. He was looking into a sun-drenched field, a place from years past. His comrades from the King's Guard were there, laughing, sparring, alive. He saw Kaelin, with his booming laugh, and Lyra, her red hair like a banner in the wind. They were whole, unburdened, turning to smile at him, to beckon him forward. The vision was so vivid, so painfully beautiful, that Elandor felt a physical ache in his chest. A part of him, the part haunted by endless nights of regret, screamed to reach out, to step into that light. "It can be real," his own voice whispered from the glass, now gentle, persuasive. "VitraMor offers not death, but restoration. A world without failure. A world where you save them. All you have to do is let go. Step through the glass. Join us." The temptation was a physical force, a siren's call that threatened to unravel his very will. It was everything he had ever wanted. Atonement, not through a lifetime of penance, but in an instant. But as he stared into the happy faces of his dead friends, his analytical mind, the part that sought truth above all else, screamed a warning. Their smiles were just a little too perfect. Their eyes held no knowledge of the horror that was to come. It was a lie. A beautiful, perfect lie. He took a staggering step back. "No," he breathed. "They are gone. This is a phantom. A trick." The image in the mirror shattered, replaced by a visage of pure, cold fury. The face was his, but twisted into a mask of rage, the eyes burning with crimson light. "Fool!" the thing in the glass roared, and the mirror surface bulged outward. "You cling to your pain like a shroud. You are a wretch who deserves his suffering. If you will not accept the gift, then you will serve as a warning." A long, slender arm, composed of what looked like liquid silver and shards of glass, shot out from the mirror. It moved with impossible speed, its clawed fingers aiming for his throat. Elandor was already moving. He threw himself to the side, the claws ripping through the fabric of his cloak instead of his flesh. He scrambled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was no mere illusion. VitraMor could reach through. The silvery arm retracted, and the mirror grew still once more, showing only the overturned, dusty room. But the voice echoed in the silence, a final, chilling promise. "The Kunoichi is already ours. Her soul is etched with our mark. When she looks into a mirror, she will see what she has lost, and she will come to us. You cannot protect her, Elandor. You cannot protect anyone." Elandor fled the cottage, the demon's laughter chasing him into the rain. He had gone seeking answers and had found a predator that fed on regret. It had tried to seduce him with his deepest desire, and when that failed, it had threatened the one person he had left. And the most terrifying part was its claim about Sayako. The silver cracks on her skin, were they more than a wound? Were they a tether? He returned to the hidden chamber, his body trembling with adrenaline and fear. Sayako was awake, her eyes clear for the first time since the attack. She saw the terror on his face, the torn cloak. "Elandor," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. He slumped against the wall, sliding to the floor. He looked at her, at the faint silver lines visible at her throat. The demon's words echoed in his mind. "She is already ours." "It spoke to me," he said, his voice hollow. "VitraMor. It knows our fears. It uses them." Sayako's gaze was unwavering. "It is a demon of lies." "Is it?" Elandor asked, the question laden with a dread he could not contain. He looked toward a small, discarded piece of polished metal in the corner of the room, a fragment of an old shield. "Sayako, don't look into any reflections." The warning came too late. He saw her eyes flicker, almost imperceptibly, toward the polished metal. He saw the faintest glimpse of her own face, and in that instant, a profound and heartbreaking sorrow filled her expression before she quickly shut her eyes. She had seen something. Something the demon had shown her. Something from her past. The enemy was not just outside, in the fog in the castle. It was here, in the darkness with them, speaking through the silvered cracks in their souls. Chapter 5, Order of the Silver Visage. The following days were a tense, silent war fought in the shadows of Sylvan Keep. Elandor maintained the facade of the diligent, slightly baffled scholar, reporting to Lord Orivan with vague theories about swamp gases and mass hysteria. Orivan listened with an air of patronizing concern, his cold eyes missing nothing. The charade was a knife's edge, every polite exchange was a duel, every glance a potential threat. Sayako's physical wound healed with the remarkable speed gifted by her rigorous training, but the silver tracery on her chest remained, a cold, pulsing brand. She avoided all reflective surfaces with a disciplined aversion, her face a mask of stoic control. But Elandor saw the strain. He saw the way her hands would sometimes tremble before she clenched them into fists, the haunted look in her eyes when she thought he wasn't watching. VitraMor's hook was in her, tugging at the deep-seated grief for her annihilated clan. They could not stay reactive. The ambush in the forest and the confrontation in Alara's cottage had proven the threat was immediate and personal. They needed to understand their enemy's structure, its heart. The cult, the Order of the Silver Visage, was the key. And Elandor knew of only one way to uncover a secret, to find another secret, deeper still. His opportunity came from an unexpected source, Lady Lord Orivan. He encountered her in the keep's library, a cavernous room smelling of old parchment and dust. She was standing before a large tapestry depicting the founding of BacHoll, her fingers lightly tracing the woven image of the first Lord Silvern. "He looks so stern," she said softly, not turning as Elandor approached. "They always make them look so stern in these things. As if a smile would undermine their authority." Elandor stopped a respectful distance away. History often prefers its heroes to be monuments, not men. Yulavana turned, her golden-tinged eyes thoughtful. She was dressed simply, a dark gown without ornament, a stark contrast to her father's opulence. "My father has been different since my mother passed. The grief changed him. But these last few years, the change has been sharper. Colder." She looked around the empty library, then lowered her voice. "He spends more and more time in the old observatory tower. He says he is studying the stars, but the servants whisper. They say he speaks to someone in there. But there is never anyone else." The observatory tower. It was a place Elandor had noted, a tall, slender spire on the keep's western edge, with windows facing not just the sky, but also the city and the forest. A perfect vantage point. "Grief can make a man seek solace in strange places," Elandor said carefully, testing the waters. Yulavana's gaze was direct, intelligent. "I do not think it is solace he is finding, Master Elandor. I think it is something else." And I fear for him. And for BacHoll. She hesitated, then reached into a fold of her dress and produced a small, rolled parchment. I found this. It fell from the pocket of Corvin's cloak. She pressed it into his hand and quickly walked away, leaving him alone with the weight of her fear and the secret she had entrusted to him. Back in the secrecy of their hidden chamber, Elandor unrolled the parchment. It was not a letter, but a map of the catacombs beneath BacHoll, a labyrinth of tunnels older than the city itself. One tunnel, leading from the riverbanks deep under the city to a point directly beneath Sylvan Keep, was marked with a single, inked symbol, the spiraling eye of Vitra. Their sanctum, Sayako whispered, looking over his shoulder. Her voice was stronger now, laced with a cold purpose. The map was a call to action, an antidote to the poisonous whispers of the demon. That night, they left the keep by the same hidden route, melting into the darkness of the lower city. The entrance to the catacombs was where the map indicated, a crumbling archway half hidden by thorny brambles on the slippery banks of the river Hull. The air that wafted from the opening was dank and carried a faint, metallic tang. They lit no torch. Sayako led the way, her night-accustomed eyes seeing paths where Elandor saw only blackness. They moved in utter silence, the only sounds the drip of water and the scuttling of unseen things in the dark. The tunnels were hewn from the living rock, slick with moisture, descending ever deeper. Then, a light. A faint, silver glow ahead. And a sound, a low, rhythmic chanting that was not quite human. It was the sound of dry leaves skittering across stone, of glass vibrating at a pitch just beyond hearing. They crept forward, pressing themselves against the cold tunnel wall. The passage opened into a vast, natural cavern. The sight that met their eyes made Elandor's blood run cold. The cavern was immense, its ceiling lost in darkness. But its walls, they were not rock. They were mirrors. Dozens of them, of all shapes and sizes, from grand full-length panels to small, hand-held shards, all set into the stone at strange, canted angles. They reflected the cavern's center from 1,000 distorted viewpoints, creating a dizzying, fractal nightmare. In the center stood a raised dais of black obsidian. Upon it, a larger mirror stood upright, its frame a tangle of wrought silver resembling twisted, agonized figures. This mirror did not reflect the cavern. Its surface was a vortex of swirling silver and gray, a storm trapped in glass. And before it, arranged in concentric circles, knelt 24 figures in silver robes, their featureless masks turned toward the vortex. The Order of the Silver Visage in its entirety. The lead cultist, the one from the forest, stood before the dais, its arms raised. The chanting was emanating from the robed figures, a hypnotic drone that seemed to make the very air hum. "We offer the echoes of their souls," the lead cultist cried out, its rustling voice amplified by the acoustics of the cavern. "We offer their regrets, their sorrows. Let the gateway be nourished. Let the great reflection grow." As the chanting rose in pitch, Elandor saw it. From the swirling vortex of the central mirror, tendrils of silvery mist began to emerge. They snaked out into the cavern, questing, hungry. They touched the surface of the smaller mirrors on the walls, and for a terrifying instant, Elandor saw faces form in the glass, the pale, agonized faces of the vanished citizens of BacHoll. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their eyes hollow pits of despair. The tendrils drank from these reflections, pulling faint, shimmering essences from them, drawing them back into the central mirror, which glowed brighter with each stolen breath. This was not just a cult. It was a feeding ground. VitraMor was not merely lurking in mirrors, it was using this place, this congregation, to actively consume the souls of those it had trapped. Then, a new figure ascended the dais. He wore no mask, and his face was grim and resolute in the argent light. Lord Orivan. "The vessel is prepared," Orivan announced, his voice ringing with a fervent, zealous certainty. "The king's court is riddled with mirrors we have placed. The puppet is ready to be worn. Soon, the falcon crown will be but a reflection, and the true power will rule from behind the glass. BacHoll is the first stone cast into the pond. The ripples will cover the kingdom." The cultists bowed their heads lower, their chanting becoming a fervent whisper. "VitraMor! VitraMor!" Elandor and Sayako exchanged a horrified glance. The scale of the conspiracy was staggering. It wasn't just about a few disappearances in a remote city. It was a plot to usurp the throne itself, to replace the king with a mirror puppet controlled by the demon. Orivan wasn't just an accomplice, he was a high priest, orchestrating the invasion. As they watched, frozen by the revelation, one of the cultists near the edge of the circle turned its head slightly. Even through the featureless mask, Elandor felt its gaze fall upon the darkness where they were concealed. It was a subtle shift, a mere tilt of the head, but it was enough. They had been seen. The spell of secrecy was broken. The lead cultist's chanting ceased. In the sudden, echoing silence, a dozen silver-masked heads turned in unison toward the tunnel entrance. There was no time for stealth. There was only time for flight. "Run," Elandor breathed. They turned and fled back into the darkness of the tunnels, the silence behind them now more terrifying than any chant. It was the silence of a predator that had just spotted its prey. The hunt was over. Now, they were the hunted. Chapter 6, Voices Behind Glass. The flight from the catacombs was a blind, desperate scramble through absolute blackness. They did not dare light a torch, relying on Sayako's preternatural senses and the memory of their path to guide them. The silence that had followed their discovery was worse than any pursuit, it was the quiet of a spider knowing the fly is already in the web. They expected an ambush at every turn, the glint of silver masks in the dark, the whisper of robes. But none came. They emerged, gasping, into the rain-swept night on the riverbank, the city of BacHoll looming above them, its windows like 1,000 watching eyes. The normalcy of the scene was jarring. The world had not ended, though they had just witnessed the seed of its undoing. Back in the hidden chamber, safe for the moment, the gravity of what they had seen settled upon them like a physical weight. "He means to replace the king," Elandor said, his voice hoarse. He paced the small room, the image of the swirling mirror and the trapped, screaming souls burned into his mind. Orivan isn't just a corrupted noble. He's a zealot. He believes in this. Sayako sat perfectly still, her hands resting on her knees. The silver tracery on her chest seemed to gleam in the dim light. The ritual. It requires sustenance. The souls they take, they are fuel for the gateway. And we are the spark that could extinguish it, Elandor replied, stopping his pacing. Orivan knows we know. He will not wait. He will move against us, and he will accelerate his plan. He looked at Sayako, his expression grim. We need to get a warning to the king. But any messenger we send will be intercepted. We are trapped here. A profound helplessness threatened to overwhelm him. They were two against a city, a cult, and a demon. The walls of Sylvan Keep, which had once seemed like a shelter, now felt like the bars of a cage. Every mirror was a potential spy, every shadow a potential assassin. It was in this state of heightened paranoia that the whispers began. At first, Elandor thought it was the wind, moaning through the countless cracks and arrow slits of the ancient fortress. But the sound soon coalesced into words, faint and sibilant, always seeming to come from just behind him, or from the other side of a wall. You failed them. He spun around, knife in hand, but the room was empty save for Sayako, who watched him with alert, concerned eyes. She heard nothing. Kalen begged for his life, did you know? While you were running. The voice was a venomous drip in his ear, using the exact tone of a long-dead comrade. It was VitraMor. The demon, knowing it could not tempt him with false hope, was now attacking with the sharpened weapons of his very real past. Ignore it, Sayako said softly, seeing the torment on his face. It is an echo. It has no power but what you give it. But it was a battle of wills he was unprepared for. The whispers were relentless, a curated symphony of his greatest regrets. He heard Lyra's voice, not laughing as in the demon's illusion, but screaming his name as the fire consumed her. He heard the accusations of the king's spymaster, the cold, dismissive words that had ended his career. He took to avoiding sleep, fearing what dreams would come. He would sit for hours, staring at the blank stone wall, trying to focus his mind on facts, on strategies, on anything but the ghosts the demon was resurrecting. The breaking point came during a tense, silent meal in their room, brought by a servant whose eyes darted everywhere but at them. Elandor reached for a pitcher of water. The pitcher was made of polished pewter, its surface dull but reflective. As his fingers closed around the handle, his own reflection looked back at him. But it was not his face. It was Kalen's, his features contorted in the agony of his final moments, his eyes pleading. Why, Elandor? Why did you leave us? Elandor recoiled with a choked cry, sending the pitcher clattering to the floor, water spreading across the stones like a dark stain. Sayako was at his side in an instant, her hand on his arm. Elandor. It's in my head, he gasped, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. It won't stop. It's using them against me. He was trembling, the disciplined scholar and warrior stripped away to reveal the raw, grieving man beneath. The guilt he had carried for years was no longer a burden, it was a weapon being wielded by a monster. Sayako's grip on his arm tightened. She did not offer empty comforts. Instead, she did something she rarely did. She spoke of her own pain. After my clan was destroyed, she began, her voice low and steady, the silence was the worst. The compound that had been filled with the sounds of training, of laughter, of life, was empty. I heard their voices, too. My master, telling me I had failed my final test. My sister, asking why I had not died with them. Elandor looked up, meeting her eyes. He saw the deep, enduring sorrow there, a mirror of his own. The demon offers you a lie to ease your pain, she continued. And when you refuse the lie, it attacks you with the truth. It believes the truth will break you. But our pain, it is not a weakness, Elandor. It is the proof of what we loved. It is the anchor to our duty. Do not let the demon steal that from you, too. Her words were a lifeline. They did not silence the whispers, they continued their insidious work, but they gave him a fortress to withstand them. His guilt was real, his failure was real. But so was his purpose now. To protect Sayako. To stop Orivan. To atone not by escaping the past, but by honoring it in the present. The next time the whispers came, slithering into his mind with promises of despair, he did not flinch. He acknowledged them, a soldier acknowledging an enemy's position. Yes, he thought, I failed. And because I remember that failure, I will not fail again. The whispers grew more frantic, more cruel, but their power was diminished. They were just noise now. The demon had lost this battle. But the war was far from over. As Elandor regained his composure, a new sound reached them, not a whisper, but a distinct, rhythmic tapping from the air vent high on the chamber wall. A code. A signal they had arranged with their only potential ally within the keep. Lady Ulivana. Elandor moved to the vent. The tapping ceased, and a small, weighted tube dropped onto the floor. He unrolled the scrap of parchment inside. The message was brief, written in a hurried hand. He knows you found the sanctum. The silver visage moves tonight. They come for you. And he prepares the final ritual at the great mirror. There is no more time. Why? The siege was beginning. The cage door was swinging shut. But Elandor was no longer a trapped animal. He was a cornered one, and he had just remembered how to fight. He looked at Sayako, and for the first time in days, his gaze was clear, his resolve hardened. It ends tonight. Sayako nodded, her hand moving to the hilt of her blade. The silver cracks on her skin seemed to pulse in agreement. The voices behind the glass had failed. Now, it was time to break the glass. Brotherhood of the Mirror. Part 2. Chapter 7, Through the Looking Glass. The message from Ulivana was a death knell and a starting pistol. The fragile pretense was shattered. Orivan knew they had discovered the heart of his conspiracy, and he would not allow them to live to tell the tale. The keep, once a place of uneasy refuge, was now a death trap. They had minutes, perhaps seconds. Elandor shoved his journal and most vital tools into his satchel. Sayako was already a vision of lethal readiness, her twin blades sheathed at her back, her every sense stretched to its limit, listening for the approach of their enemies. The main gates will be watched. The servants' entrance too, Elandor said, his mind racing through the keep's blueprints he had memorized. Our only chance is the old postern gate in the western wall. It's near the observatory tower. Sayako gave a sharp nod. It was the most dangerous route, taking them directly towards the lion's den, but it was the only path left unblocked. They slipped from the chamber into the cold, dark corridor. The usual nocturnal sounds of the keep were absent, replaced by an ominous, waiting silence. They moved like phantoms, sticking to the deepest shadows. The air grew colder as they neared the western wing, a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty stones. As they rounded a corner, they found their path blocked. Four silver-masked cultists stood before the heavy oak door that led to the western courtyard. They were not patrolling, they were waiting. The lead cultist tilted its head. The naturalist and his shadow, it whispered, the sound like grinding glass. The great reflection awaits your essence. There was no discussion, no negotiation. Sayako moved first, a blur of motion as she flung a handful of caltrops across the stone floor. Two cultists lunged forward, their steps faltering as the sharp metal bit into their feet. Elandor was on them in an instant, his long knife a silver arc in the gloom. He fought with a cold, focused fury, the whispers of the demon now fuel for his rage. These were not phantoms of his past, these were the tangible instruments of the evil he had sworn to stop. Sayako engaged the other two, her blades a whirlwind of defensive strikes, parrying the cultists' glass-tipped hands. The fight was swift and brutal. Elandor disabled one cultist with a deep cut to the arm, while Sayako used her opponent's momentum to slam him into the stone wall with a sickening crunch. But more were coming. The sound of running feet echoed from both ends of the corridor. They were surrounded. The door. Elandor yelled, shoving his shoulder against the heavy oak. It was barred from the other side. Sayako turned, her back to his, facing the approaching threats. There is no way out. Elandor's eyes swept the corridor desperately. And then he saw it. Set into the wall between two torches was a large, decorative mirror in a gilded frame, meant to give the illusion of space in the narrow hall. A reckless, terrifying idea sparked in his mind. It was a gamble with their very souls, but the alternative was certain death. There is one way, he said, his voice tight. The demon's own path. Sayako followed his gaze, understanding dawning in her eyes. It was a look of pure horror, but also of resolve. To be captured meant a fate worse than death. To die fighting was honorable. But to step into the enemy's domain, it was madness. But it was their only chance. The cultists were closing in, a wall of silver masks and rustling robes. Elandor grabbed a torch from its sconce. When I give the word, he said to Sayako, his eyes locked on the mirror. He threw the torch. It sailed through the air and struck the glass not with a shatter, but with a sound like a stone dropped into deep water. The surface of the mirror rippled, the reflection of the corridor distorting into a swirling vortex of silver and black. The glasshound was opening its maw. Now! Elandor roared. They turned and ran, not away from the cultists, but directly towards the undulating mirror. The lead cultist screamed a raw, inhuman sound of fury. No! You are not worthy. You are not purified. Elandor and Sayako leaped. The world dissolved into a scream of fractured light and a sensation of being pulled apart and woven back together. There was no up or down, no solidity. It was a plunge through a kaleidoscope of stolen memories and broken reflections. Elandor saw flashes of the faces from the catacombs, their silent screams now a deafening roar in his ears. He felt a cold that seeped into his bones, a cold that was the absence of life itself. Then, impact. They landed hard on a surface that was neither stone nor earth. It was smooth, cold, and unyielding, and it rang with a faint, crystalline chime at their impact. Elandor pushed himself to his hands and knees, his head spinning. The air was thin, stale, and carried the same metallic ozone stench of the cult's sanctum, but 1,000 times stronger. He looked up, and his breath caught in his throat. They were in the mirror world. The sky was a swirling morass of gray and silver, like a thundercloud made of liquid mercury. There was no sun, no moon, only a diffuse, sourceless light that cast no shadows. The ground beneath them was a vast, perfectly flat plane of dark, polished glass that reflected the chaotic sky above, creating a dizzying infinity. In the distance, structures rose, not buildings, but jagged, crystalline formations that looked like the skeletons of towers and trees, all rendered in sharp, reflective angles. It was a world of echoes. Whispers drifted on the non-existent wind, the ghosts of conversations and thoughts stolen by the demon. Figures moved at the edges of vision, but when he turned to look, they were gone, leaving only a shimmer in the air. It was a prison for souls, a gallery of captured moments of pain and regret. Sayako rose beside him, her face pale. The silver tracery on her chest was glowing with a fierce, cold light, a beacon in this monochrome hellscape. "We are inside it," she said, her voice hushed with awe and revulsion. Elandor's analytical mind, even in this nightmare, began to work. This is VitraMor's domain. This is where it draws its power. The reflections in our world, they are windows here. A sound made them turn. From behind a shard of crystalline rock that resembled a petrified tree, a figure emerged. It was a man, or the ghost of one. He was translucent, his form flickering. It was the weaver, Alaric. His eyes were hollow, and he moved with a puppet's jerky gait. "You should not be here," the spectre moaned, its voice a dry rustle. "The master will feast on your light. He will add your regrets to his collection." More figures appeared from behind the glassy structures, the cobbler's apprentice, the fishmonger, all the vanished souls of BacHoll. They were hollowed out, their essences drained, leaving only shells that echoed with their final moments of terror. They began to shuffle forward, their arms outstretched not in threat, but in a pathetic imitation of supplication. "Join us," they whispered in unison, a chorus of despair. "Stay in the reflection. It is easier than the pain of living." Elandor felt a profound pity for them, but also a cold dread. They were not the enemy, they were the victims. The true enemy was the intelligence that had created this place. A familiar laugh echoed across the glass plane, a sound that was both intimate and utterly alien. From the largest of the crystalline structures, a palace of frozen tears, a figure descended. It was formed of shifting mercury and shards of broken mirror, its shape constantly changing, never settling. One moment it had the noble bearing of Lord Orivan, the next the lithe form of Sayako, then the grim visage of Elandor himself. This was no mere reflection. This was the source. VitraMor had taken a form to greet its guests. "Welcome," it said, its voice a symphony of every whisper Elandor had heard, every regret that haunted him. "Welcome to the truth. This is what lies behind the glass. This is the world as it truly is, a collection of broken images, waiting to be sorted and consumed." The demon gestured with a fluid, silvery arm towards the shuffling souls. "They are at peace now. Their pain is mine to bear. As yours will be." It fixed its ever-changing gaze on Elandor. "You were too stubborn for my gifts. So I will take instead. I will take the Kunoichi's soul. It is already half mine. Her grief is a vintage I have been savoring." The form of VitraMor shifted, melting into the precise image of Sayako's clan master, his face stern yet filled with a sorrow she had only seen the night he died. "You abandoned us, child," it said in a perfect mimicry of his voice, the words a dagger aimed directly at Sayako's heart. "You live while we are dust. Why?" Sayako staggered as if struck, a gasp escaping her lips. The demon was playing its final, cruelest card. It had brought them into its world, and now it would break them within it. They were trapped in the looking glass, and the reflection staring back was a nightmare made real. Chapter 8, The Demon's Game. The sound of her master's voice, a sound she had both longed for and dreaded for years, struck Sayako with the force of a physical blow. The image of the old man, his face etched with the very real disappointment she had feared above all else, was a masterful cruelty. For a heartbeat, the disciplined Kunoichi vanished, leaving only a grieving daughter of a dead clan. Elandor saw her falter. He saw the silver tracery on her chest flare, a sickly beacon answering its master's call. He stepped forward, placing himself between Sayako and the shifting horror that was VitraMor. "Your lies have no power here," Elandor snarled, though the claim felt hollow in this place of pure falsehood. He focused not on the demon, but on its method. It was a predator that hunted with psychology. It needed their despair, their acceptance. Denial was its weakness. VitraMor's form rippled, dissolving from the clan master into a swirling vortex of light. The voice that emerged was now a chilling amalgam of Elandor's dead comrades. "No power. I am the only power. I am the final truth that waits behind every vanity, every pretense. You build your lives on fragile glass, and you are shocked when it cracks." The glassy plain beneath their feet shimmered, and the scene around them dissolved. The monochrome hellscape was replaced by a sun-drenched field. It was the same field from Elandor's temptation, but now it was perfect. The grass was emerald green, the sky a brilliant blue. Kaelin and Lyra were there, whole and vibrant, their laughter ringing true. But this time, Elandor was not an observer. He was in the field. He could feel the sun on his skin, smell the wildflowers. "This is the gift I offered," VitraMor's voice whispered on the breeze. "Not a memory, but a reality. A branch of time where you made the right choice. Where you led them to safety. Stay here, Elandor. This can be your eternity." The illusion was breathtakingly complete. Lyra walked towards him, her smile radiant, her hand outstretched. "You saved us, Elandor. You finally saved us." The temptation was an ache in his soul, a siren song promising an end to a lifetime of penance. He could almost feel his fingers brushing hers. No. The thought was not his own, but a fragment of Sayako's discipline, echoing in his mind. It is a lie. It has no power but what you give it. He looked past Lyra's hopeful face, past the idyllic scene. He focused on the edges. And there, he saw the cracks. The blue of the sky had a silvery, oily sheen. The horizon wavered like a heat haze. The laughter of his friends had the faint, rhythmic quality of a recording, missing the subtle imperfections of true joy. It was a masterful forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. "You are wrong," Elandor said, his voice firm, though it cost him everything to speak. "This is not a branch of time. This is a cage. You did not save them. You stole their faces to build this prison." He turned his back on Lyra's pleading expression. "I will not live in a lie." The field shattered like glass. They were back in the silver-gray hellscape, the hollowed souls moaning around them. VitraMor's form coalesced into a towering pillar of rage, its surface boiling with sharp, jagged edges. "Then perish in the truth," it roared. The demon's attention shifted instantly to Sayako, its fury now a scalpel. The scene changed again. They were no longer on the plain, but in a courtyard of dark wood and paper lanterns. The air smelled of cherry blossoms and incense. It was the training ground of Sayako's clan, on the night it was destroyed. Shadows moved at the edges, figures locked in silent, deadly combat. And in the center, stood her sister, Miho, her face a mask of terror and betrayal. "You ran." Miho screamed, her voice raw. "You were supposed to protect us. You were the best of us, and you ran." This illusion was sharper, more personal. It attacked not with a promise of peace, but with the unvarnished accusation that had haunted Sayako's every waking moment. The silver cracks on her chest blazed like lightning, and she cried out, falling to her knees on the illusory gravel. "I did not run," she whispered, but the words were choked with guilt. "I fought. You survived." VitraMor shrieked through Miho's mouth. "That is your sin. Your survival is your failure. Join us here, in this moment of your shame. Embrace it. It is all you deserve." Sayako's shoulders shook. The discipline of a lifetime was crumbling under the weight of a pain too acute to bear. Elandor moved to her side, but he knew he could not fight this battle for her. This was her demon, her reflection in the glass. He dropped to one knee beside her, his voice low and urgent, cutting through the phantom screams. "Sayako. Listen to me. It shows you this because it fears you. It fears your strength. Your survival is not a failure. It is a weapon. It is the reason you are here now, to ensure no other clan falls to a darkness like this. Your honor is not in dying with them, but in living for them." He wasn't sure if the words were getting through. Her eyes were clenched shut, tears tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. Then, she spoke, her voice a ragged thread, but clear. "You are not my sister." She opened her eyes, and the sorrow in them was now forged into something harder, sharper. "My sister's last words to me were not of blame. They were of live. She rose to her feet, her movement slow but deliberate. She looked directly at the phantom of Miho, her gaze unwavering. "You are a phantom. A parasite feeding on my grief. You have no right to her face." She took a step forward, and then another. With each step, the illusion of the courtyard flickered. The screaming shadows faded. The cherry blossom scent turned to dust. "My pain is mine," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It is part of me. It is not a toy for you." She stood before the image of her sister, which now wavered, its features melting into a snarl of silver light. Sayako did not strike it. She simply looked at it, with all the weight of her lived grief and her enduring will. The illusion shattered. They were back in the mirror world, and VitraMor recoiled, its form shrinking, its light dimming. The demon had played its strongest cards, and both players had refused the game. It had fed on despair its entire existence, and for the first time, it had been presented with something it could not digest: acceptance. Not the acceptance of defeat, but the acceptance of pain as a part of life, not its entirety. A low, guttural growl emanated from the core of the demon. The hollow souls around them cowered. "You defy the nature of this place," VitraMor hissed, its voice losing its symphonic quality, becoming raw and single-toned. "You are impurities. Flaws in the glass. You will be excised." The ground began to tremble. The crystalline structures shook, and from their facets, new figures began to emerge. These were not the hollow victims. These were solid, dark, and moved with a predatory grace. They were the silver-visaged cultists, but here, in their master's domain, they were more than men. They were extensions of VitraMor's will, their silver masks fused to faces of solid glass, their eyes burning with crimson light. The demon's game was over. Now, it would simply break them. Chapter 9, The Mirror's Heart. The shattering of its illusions had not destroyed VitraMor, but it had wounded its pride. The subtle predator was gone, replaced by a cornered, furious beast. The mirror world itself reacted to its master's rage. The glassy plane cracked under their feet, jagged fissures snaking outwards, revealing a dizzying void of swirling silver beneath. The air hummed with a hostile energy, and the whispers of the trapped souls became screams of terror. The cultists that emerged from the crystalline structures were no longer the robed fanatics of the catacombs. Here, they were purified, reduced to their essence, human-shaped vessels of animated glass, their movements jerky and unnaturally swift. Their featureless masks were now their true faces, and from behind them glowed the same malevolent crimson light that burned in the depths of VitraMor's form. They were avatars of the demon's will, and they advanced without sound, without breath, a tide of sharp, killing edges. "They are the gatekeepers," Elandor shouted over the rising cacophony, his knife feeling woefully inadequate against creatures of solid glass. "They guard the way to the source." "The heart," Sayako said, her voice calm amidst the storm. Her eyes were clear, the ghost of her clan master exorcised. The silver tracery on her chest still pulsed, but it was now a cold, focused light, a compass needle pointing toward the center of the storm. She pointed with one of her blades toward the largest of the crystalline structures, the Palace of Frozen Tears. From its pinnacle, a rhythmic, throbbing light emanated, a sickly silver pulse that matched the beat of the fissure spreading across the plain. There. It was not a question. It was a certainty. The heart of the mirror was there, the anchor point of VitraMor's power in this dimension. There was no time for a plan, only for action. They fought their way forward, a desperate, running battle across the cracking plain. Elandor quickly learned that slashing at the glass cultists was useless, his knife skittered off their hard surfaces. He had to use brute force, shattering them with kicks from his heavy boots or by slamming them into the sharp, rising shards of the ground. It was exhausting, desperate work. Sayako was an artist of destruction. She did not try to break the cultists, she dismantled them. Her curved blades found the microscopic flaws, the seams where limb met torso, the weak points at the joints. With precise, ringing strikes, she severed arms, shattered legs, and decapitated the glassy figures, reducing them to piles of twitching, glittering shards. But for every one they destroyed, 2 more emerged from the trembling structures. They were endless, a reflection of the demon's infinite malice. A shard of glass, flung by a cultist, sliced across Elandor's cheek, adding a new line of blood to his collection of scars. Another grazed Sayako's arm, drawing a thin red line. They were being worn down, cornered. The path to the crystalline palace was choked with enemies. We cannot fight them all. Elandor yelled, parrying a glass-taloned hand that would have torn out his throat. Sayako's eyes darted around, analyzing the battlefield as she moved. She saw what Elandor, in his focus on survival, had not. The hollow souls, the victims, were cowering, but they were watching. And they were not watching the fight, they were watching her. Specifically, the glowing silver mark on her chest. VitraMor had branded her, claiming her as its own. But that connection was a two-way street. She made a decision that bordered on madness. She stopped fighting and stood her ground, lowering her blades. Elandor, to me, she commanded. He fell back to her side, confused but trusting. The glass cultists paused, their advance halting for a moment, as if confused by this surrender. Sayako closed her eyes and focused inward, on the cold, pulsing brand. She did not try to fight it. Instead, she embraced it. She reached out through the connection, not to the demon, but to the thousands of stolen souls trapped in this hell. She poured her own will, her own pain, her own refusal to be broken, down that silver tether. It was not a message of words, but of feeling. A wave of defiance. A memory of sunlight on real grass. The taste of clean water. The bond of loyalty she shared with Elandor. Simple, fundamental truths of a life lived outside the glass. A shudder ran through the mirror world. The hollow souls, who had been moaning in despair, fell silent. One by one, they lifted their heads. The hollow pits of their eyes began to glow with a soft, warm light, a pale imitation of life, but life nonetheless. They turned their gaze from Sayako to the glass cultists advancing on her. And then they attacked. It was not a physical assault. They had no substance. But they flowed over the glass cultists like a tide of light, their ethereal forms passing through the solid glass. Where they touched, the crimson light in the cultists' eyes flickered and died. The cultists froze, their forms clouding, becoming opaque and brittle. Then, with a sound like 1,000 icicles snapping, they shattered, collapsing into inert piles of dust. Sayako had turned VitraMor's power against it. She had used the demon's own connection to her to remind the trapped souls of what they had lost, awakening a final, ghostly spark of resistance. They could not save themselves, but they could buy a path for their saviors. The way to the crystalline palace was clear. Now. Sayako gasped, stumbling forward. The effort had drained her, the silver tracery on her chest was now dull, the connection severed by her own will. They ran, leaping over the widening fissures in the plain, until they reached the base of the structure. It was not a building with an entrance, but a solid, multifaceted gem the size of a castle keep. The throbbing light came from its very core. "How do we get in?" Elandor demanded, pounding a fist against the impossibly hard surface. Sayako placed her hand on the crystal. It was vibrating, humming with the power of the heart within. "It is a mirror. It does not have a door. It has a surface." She drew one of her blades. Instead of striking the crystal, she focused, holding the polished steel of the blade up before the facet. She did not look at her own reflection. She looked through it, as if the blade were a lens. She poured her will into it, the same will she had used to rally the souls, seeking the flaw, the crack in the demon's perfect prison. The surface of the crystalline structure in front of them rippled. It did not become transparent, but it became permeable. Like the surface of a pond. "It will not hold long," she said, her voice strained. Elandor did not hesitate. He took her hand, and together, they stepped through the looking glass once more. The inside of the crystal was not a room. It was a nexus of light and agony. In the center, suspended in a web of silvery energy, was a pulsating, organic-looking mass of pure light. It was beautiful and horrifying, a captured star veined with black, cancerous tendrils. This was the heart of the mirror. Around it, like moths to a flame, swirled the shimmering essences of the recently taken souls, their light being slowly drained into the core. And standing before the heart, his form silhouetted against its brutal radiance, was a man. His back was to them, but they knew him instantly. The elegant clothing, the silver hair. Lord Orivan. He was here, in the flesh, within the demon's realm. He turned. His face was a mask of ecstatic fervor, but his eyes were not his own. They were pools of the same crimson light that burned in the cultists. Veins like cracks in porcelain spread from his temples, pulsing with silver energy. The pact had progressed. He was no longer just a servant, he was becoming a vessel. "You," he spat, his voice layered with another, deeper resonance. "You dare profane this sanctum? You are but flawed reflections, soon to be corrected." He raised a hand, and the very air around them solidified, seeking to crush them. The final battle for the heart had begun, and the master of the silver visage stood in their way. Chapter 10, Return Through Glass. The air in the heart chamber was thick as syrup, pressing in on them with a tangible, malevolent will. Elandor felt as if he were trying to move through solidifying lead. Every breath was a struggle, every inch of forward motion a victory against the crushing weight of VitraMor's power, channeled through its chosen vessel. Lord Orivan stood before the pulsating heart, his body a conduit for the silvery energy that snaked up from the floor and into his veins. The cracks on his face glowed fiercely, and his crimson eyes held no trace of the cold, calculating noble they had first met. There was only the fanaticism of the utterly possessed. "You see the future," Orivan boomed, his voice a dissonant chorus of his own and the demons. "A world without the messy imperfections of flesh. A world of perfect, eternal order, reflected 1,000 times, forever. Why do you fight it? Why cling to your fleeting, painful lives?" Elandor gritted his teeth, forcing another step forward. The pressure was immense, a psychic assault meant to break their will before a blow was even struck. "Because it's not life," he ground out. "It's a collection. A trophy room for a parasite." Sayako, moving with the fluid grace that defied the physical pressure, slid past Elandor. She said nothing. Words were Elandor's weapon. Hers was action. Her focus was not on Orivan, but on the pulsing heart behind him. It was the source. The demon was the disease, but this was the tumor. Orivan sneered, a grotesque expression on his partially transformed features. "You think you can destroy it? This heart is the culmination of centuries of harvested regret. It is a power beyond your comprehension." He gestured, and shards of crystallized energy ripped themselves from the walls of the chamber, hurling towards them like daggers. Elandor ducked and weaved, his cloak tearing as a shard grazed his shoulder. Sayako was a whirlwind, her blades deflecting the projectiles in a shower of sparks, each parry ringing with a high, crystalline chime. They couldn't get close. Orivan was too well protected, his control over the environment too absolute. Elandor's mind raced, searching for a weakness. He saw the way the silvery tendrils connected Orivan to the heart. The nobleman was not just a vessel, he was an anchor, tethering the demon's power to this focal point. The connection. Elandor yelled to Sayako. "Sever the connection." Sayako understood instantly. She changed her tactics, no longer trying to reach Orivan directly. Instead, she began to target the energy tendrils that snaked across the floor. Her blades, sharpened to a supernatural keenness, sliced through them. Each severed tendril caused Orivan to flinch, the crimson light in his eyes flickering momentarily. A roar of pain and fury, both human and demonic, erupted from his throat. "Insects," he screamed. "You dare!" The chamber trembled violently. The captured souls swirling around the heart wailed in unison. Orivan abandoned his defensive posture and lunged at Sayako, his hands now claw-like, tipped with sharp, glassy talons. The fight became close, brutal, and personal. Elandor saw his chance. While Orivan was distracted by Sayako's blindingly fast attacks, he scrambled towards the heart itself. The light was blinding up close, the heat intense. The black tendrils within it pulsed like diseased arteries. He didn't have a weapon that could destroy such a thing. His knife was useless. But he was a naturalist. He understood symbiosis, parasitism, and the delicate balance of power. The heart was a thing of pure reflection, of stolen energy. It was not meant to create, only to consume. To introduce something alien, something original and untainted, into its core. He remembered the amulet he wore, the king's falcon. It was a symbol of the real world, of duty and a life lived outside the glass. It was made of simple, honest iron. He ripped it from his neck. Orivan, sensing the threat, threw Sayako aside with a surge of demonic strength and turned towards Elandor. No. But he was too late. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Elandor plunged the cold iron amulet directly into the searing light of the heart. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The heart did not explode. It convulsed. The perfect, rhythmic pulse became a frantic, erratic stutter. The silvery light darkened, clouded with inky blackness. The captured souls, their tethers suddenly severed, burst free from their prison, their forms flashing with a final, brilliant light before winking out of existence, not consumed, but released. A deafening shriek filled the chamber, the sound of 1,000 mirrors shattering at once. It was the sound of VitraMor's agony. The psychic pressure vanished. The chamber began to collapse around them, the crystalline walls cracking and dissolving into motes of dust. The mirror world was dying. Orivan stumbled back from the dying heart, his body racked with spasms. The silvery veins on his face darkened, and the crimson light in his eyes faded, leaving behind only the pale, horrified blue of a man waking from a nightmare to find himself a monster. He looked at his cracking hands, at the dissolving world around him. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice his own again, filled with a terror that was entirely human. There was no time for his remorse. The floor beneath them gave way. Elandor and Sayako were falling once more through a chaos of breaking light and screaming void. The return journey was even more violent than the entry, a cataclysmic expulsion from a reality that was ceasing to exist. They landed with a bone-jarring impact on cold, wet stone. The air was thick with the familiar smells of damp and decay. They were back in the catacombs beneath BacHoll. The central mirror on the dais was now a dead, black hole in the world, its surface cracked and opaque. Around them, the cultists' robes lay in empty heaps, their silver masks shattered on the floor. Without VitraMor's power to sustain them, the Order of the Silver Visage had simply ceased to be. Elandor pushed himself up, his body aching in every muscle. Sayako was already on her feet, breathing heavily, her eyes scanning the cavern. The silver tracery on her chest was gone, vanished with the demon's retreat. But as the last echoes of the mirror world's death cry faded, a final, venomous whisper slithered into Elandor's mind, a last gasp from a defeated foe. "You have broken my lens, but the world is full of mirrors, naturalist. I am in every regret, every vanity. I am waiting." And the girl, her soul still bears the ghost of my touch. She will never be free of me. The voice faded, leaving behind only the drip of water and the profound silence of the empty cavern. They had won. They had shattered the heart and destroyed the cult. But as Elandor looked at Sayako, he knew the victory was incomplete. VitraMor was wounded, but not destroyed. It had retreated into the countless reflections of the world, a cancer in remission. And it had left its mark on Sayako. Not a physical scar, but a spiritual one. A reflection of the demon's voice that, he feared, might one day whisper to her from the inside. Chapter 11, The Mask Revealed. The silence in the catacombs was absolute, a stark contrast to the psychic roar of the dying mirror world. Elandor and Sayako stood amidst the discarded robes and shattered masks of the cult, their own breath loud in the sudden stillness. The immediate threat was gone, but the air was thick with the aftermath, heavy with the scent of ozone and something else, the cold, clean smell of shattered glass. They had to move. The collapse of the mirror world might have physical consequences. And Lord Orivan was still out there, his mind newly cleared of the demon's influence, but his body forever marked by his pact. They emerged from the catacombs onto the riverbank to a city in the grip of a strange phenomenon. The perpetual rain had stopped, but a new kind of storm had hit BacHoll. All across the city, from the meanest hovels to the highest windows of Sylvan Keep, mirrors were cracking. It was a symphony of fracturing glass, 1,000 sharp reports echoing through the streets as the silvered surfaces clouded, splintered, and went dark. The magical bonds holding VitraMor's influence in place had been severed. The people of BacHoll were emerging from their homes, not in celebration, but in terrified confusion, staring at their broken reflections. The demon's subtle hold on the city was broken, but the revelation of its presence was just beginning. Elandor and Sayako did not head for the city gates. Their path led upward, to the source. To Sylvan Keep. They moved through the chaotic streets unchallenged, the guards at the keep's main gate too bewildered by the shattering of the great mirror in the courtyard to pay them any mind. The interior of the keep was in turmoil. Servants ran to and fro, whispering of curses and ill omens. The air of cold control that Orivan had imposed was gone, replaced by a frantic, leaderless energy. They found him in the observatory tower, just as Yulavana had said. The room was a testament to his descent. Astronomical charts were piled haphazardly alongside scrolls scrawled with the spiraling eye of Vitra. In the center of the room, facing a large, now blackened window that had once held a polished glass pane, stood Lord Orivan. He had his back to them. His shoulders, usually held with rigid authority, were slumped. The elegant velvet of his doublet was torn and smudged with soot. He was staring at his reflection in the dead glass, but it was no longer a true reflection. The silver cracks that marred his skin were now permanent, a web of corruption etched into his flesh. The crimson light was gone from his eyes, but the horror of what he had done remained, staring back at him. "It promised me eternity," he said, his voice ragged, without turning. "It promised that my line would never end, that my legacy would be as permanent as polished silver. All it asked for was a gateway. A few souls, a city, a kingdom. It seemed a fair price for immortality." Elandor stepped into the room, Sayako a silent shadow at his side. "You sold your people to a demon, Orivan. You sold your own soul." Orivan turned slowly. The man they saw was a broken shell. The cold charisma was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out despair. But as his eyes fell on Sayako, a spark of his old venom returned. "And you," he spat. "You, the foreign shadow. You were the key. Your bond with him, it made him resilient. I should have had you killed the moment you arrived." "Your demon tried," Sayako replied, her voice flat and cold. "It is not my demon." Orivan shouted, the outburst sudden and raw. A spasm of pain crossed his face, and he clutched at his chest. "It used me. It preyed on my grief for my wife, my fear for my daughter's future. It showed me a world of perfect order, a world where nothing is ever lost." "A lie," Elandor said, advancing. "A prison. And you were its chief jailer. I was its savior." Orivan insisted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I was bringing a new age. You have ruined everything. You have left us with nothing but the decay and the pain." He gestured wildly at the cracked skin on his face. "You see what it has done to me? This is the truth you fought for. This rot." It was then that a new figure appeared in the doorway. Lady Yalavana, her face pale but her jaw set with a determined strength. She had heard everything. "Father," she said, her voice trembling but clear. Orivan stared at his daughter, and for a moment, the fanatic and the broken man were replaced by something else, a father's shame. "Yalavana, you should not be here." "Is it true?" she asked, her golden-tinged eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What they say? The disappearances, the mirrors, you did this?" The mask of the noble lord, the last pretense he had left, crumbled completely under his daughter's gaze. He could not lie to her. His shoulders sagged, and he looked away. "I did it for you," he whispered, a pathetic, hollow excuse. "To secure your future." Yalavana took a step back as if struck. "My future?" The words were a soft, horrified breath. "You built my future on the graves of innocent people. On a pact with a monster." She shook her head, a terrible finality in the gesture. "That is not a future. That is a damnation." Her rejection was the final blow. Orivan's face twisted, the human shame warring with the last vestiges of the demon's corruption. The silver cracks on his skin began to glow again, not with the fierce light of possession, but with a feverish, unstable energy. "You see?" he screamed at Elandor, his body beginning to tremble violently. "You have taken everything. My power. My legacy. My daughter. You leave me with only this affliction." The glow intensified, the cracks widening. Orivan was not transforming by will, he was coming apart at the seams. The pact had fundamentally altered him, and with VitraMor's presence severed, his body could no longer contain the conflicting energies. "Yalavana, get back!" Elandor commanded, pulling the young woman away from the doorway. Orivan let out a final, agonized cry that was neither fully human nor fully demonic. There was a sound like shattering crystal, and a blinding flash of silver light erupted from his body. When the light faded, Lord Orivan of House Silvern was gone. In his place stood a shuddering, monstrous figure. One half of his body remained recognizably human, though ravaged by the cracks. The other half had transformed into a living statue of mirrored glass, reflecting the horrified faces of the onlookers in a distorted nightmare. He was a man trapped in the moment of his own corruption, a permanent, walking reflection of his folly. The thing that was once Orivan let out a guttural roar and lunged, not with strategy, but with the mindless fury of a wounded beast. The final battle was not against a cunning antagonist, but against a tragic, monstrous consequence. The mask had not just been revealed, it had become the face. Chapter 12, The Road of Reflections. The thing that had been Lord Orivan was a nightmare given form. Its glass half glittered with the fractured light from the tower window, reflecting the scene in 100 distorted shards. Its human half contorted in a silent scream of perpetual agony. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its glass foot scraping against the stone floor with a sound that set Elandor's teeth on edge. It lunged, not for Elandor, but for Yulavana, a final, twisted impulse of the father to either reclaim or destroy the daughter who had rejected him. A glass-alone hand, sharp as a razor, swept toward her face. Elandor was faster. He shoved Yulavana behind him and met the charge with his own, not with a blade, but with his shoulder, driving into the creature's midsection. It was like tackling a statue. Pain exploded in his collarbone, but he succeeded in driving the monster back a few precious steps, away from the terrified girl. Sayako flowed into the space Elandor had created. She knew steel was useless against the glass half. Her target was the remaining flesh. Her blades were a silver blur, aiming for tendons, arteries, any point that could disable the human part of the horror and bring it down. But the creature was unpredictably fast, its glass arm whipping around to parry her strikes with a sound like ringing bells. A shard of its own substance flew off, slicing a thin cut across Sayako's cheek. The fight was a brutal, close-quarters affair in the confined space of the tower room. There was no finesse, only survival. Elandor used his weight and strength, grappling with the monstrous form, trying to keep the deadly glass limbs pinned. Sayako darted in and out, her attacks precise and relentless, finding gaps in its defense. Yulavana cowered against the wall, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror that went beyond fear. It was the horror of witnessing the utter destruction of her father. The creature roared, a sound of breaking glass and tearing flesh, and threw Elandor off with demonic strength. He crashed into a table, sending scrolls and astrolabes flying. It turned its full attention to Sayako, its crimson glowing eye, the one part of the demon that remained, fixed on her with pure hatred. "Shadow," it gurgled. "You stole him from me." It unleashed a frenzied attack, all rage and no skill. Sayako deflected and dodged, but the force of the blows drove her back toward the large, blackened window. A taloned hand, this one of flesh and bone but tipped with sharp, crystalline growths, shot out and grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off her feet. She gasped, her blades clattering to the floor. "I will break you first," the monster snarled. Elandor, shaking off his daze, saw Sayako's face begin to turn blue. He saw the creature's back exposed. There was no time for strategy. With a raw cry, he picked up a heavy, metal-bound ledger from the floor and charged, bringing it down with all his might on the creature's head. The impact was sickening. The human half of the skull gave way with a wet crunch. The creature staggered, its grip on Sayako loosening. It dropped her and turned slowly, its one human eye rolling back in its head. The glass half of its face remained impassive, a cold, dead mask. It took one stumbling step toward Elandor, its glass hand raising for a final, dying strike. And then Yulavana was there. She held a long, silver letter opener she had snatched from the desk. Her face was streaked with tears, but her hand was steady. With a cry that was part sob, part battle shout, she drove the blade deep into the human side of the creature's chest, into the heart of the man who had been her father. The creature froze. A tremor ran through its whole body. The crimson light in its eye flickered and died. The glass half of its form clouded over, becoming dull and opaque. Then, with a great, sighing shudder, the thing that was Lord Orivan collapsed to the floor. The glass parts shattered into a million pieces, while the flesh slumped, finally, terribly, still. Silence descended, broken only by Yulavana's ragged sobs as she sank to her knees beside the remains. Elandor rushed to Sayako, who was kneeling, rubbing her throat. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her breath coming in gasps. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw the same exhaustion, the same grim satisfaction, and the same lingering dread that he felt. It was over. But nothing was truly resolved. They left Yulavana to her grief, descending the tower to a keep in chaos. The news of Orivan's death and the revelation of his pact spread through BacHoll like wildfire. The city was freed from the immediate threat, but it was a city scarred by fear and mistrust. The broken mirrors in every home were a constant reminder of the horror that had lived among them. In the days that followed, Elandor and Sayako helped impose a fragile order. They exposed the remnants of the conspiracy, such as they were, mostly frightened servants and minor functionaries who had obeyed out of fear. The true cult was gone, dissolved with VitraMor's retreat. On the morning they prepared to leave, a light rain had begun to fall again, as if the world was resetting to its natural state. They stood in the main courtyard, their horses saddled. Yulavana approached them. She looked older, her youthful innocence replaced by a weary resolve. "The king's men will arrive within the week to assume control," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have told them everything. The name of Orivan will be stripped from this house. I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for my father's sins." "The sins were his, not yours," Elandor said gently. "The legacy is mine to bear," she replied. She looked at Sayako. "Thank you. For everything." Sayako gave a slight, respectful nod. As they rode through the city gates and onto the muddy road leading away from BacHoll, neither spoke. The misty forests of the Eldermark rose before them, a sea of unknowns. It was then that Elandor noticed it. Sayako, usually so impeccably poised, swayed slightly in her saddle. Her face had lost all its color. "Sayako." She tried to wave him off, but the motion was weak. Her eyes lost focus, and she slumped forward. Elandor caught her just before she fell from her horse. He lowered her to the wet ground, his heart pounding with a new, terrifying fear. The physical wound from the cultist's shard had healed. The silver tracery was gone. But as he cradled her, he saw it. A tiny, almost invisible silver line, like a thread of mercury, tracing the path of a vein at her temple. It was faint, but it pulsed with a familiar, sickly light. VitraMor's final whisper had been a truth. The demon had left a seed inside her. A piece of the mirror world, dormant, waiting. Sayako's eyes fluttered open. They were her own eyes, filled with pain and a grim understanding. She had known. She had felt it. "It is not over," she whispered. Elandor held her tighter, looking from her face to the road ahead, a path that led into the mist-shrouded wilderness. The Brotherhood of the Mirror had survived its first trial. But the war against the Reflection was just beginning. They had a new mission now, more personal and more desperate than any king's command, to find a way to scour the demon's touch from Sayako's soul before it could claim her. He lifted her back onto her horse, securing her in the saddle. Then he mounted his own steed, and together, two shadows against the gray landscape, they rode away from the city of broken glass, their future a reflection as uncertain as the rain-filled puddles on the road ahead.